Okay, so we're going to get started here with part two now. So in the first part, we talked a little bit about um, some, some embryonic development of our nervous system. We mentioned our different parts of our brain, the prosencephalon, the rhombencephalon, the telencephalon, all these different parts. Now we'll talk a little bit about some kind of surface anatomy. We'll talk about some features that you'll be able to see on a brain, whether it's a model, whether it is a sheep brain during a dissection or something like that. You'll be able to see these different things. So to start off, we have the term gyrus, sulcus, and fissure. And so you're likely familiar with just the general surface of a brain. It has all these little ridges and wrinkles. Um, each one of these ridges is known as a gyrus. Now, gyrus, that's singular. When you have multiple of them, you'll call them gyri. In between adjacent gyri, you have grooves, and these grooves are known as sulci, or sulcus being singular. Now, a fissure, a fissure is essentially just a deeper groove, and so sulci and fissure are basically the same thing, with a sulcus being a more shallow groove and a fissure being a deeper groove. You've likely seen on an image of a brain or a model that you've seen before, or even if you've done a dissection before, that your brain has a left and right hemisphere. And running right down the middle, there's a deep groove there, and that is called the longitudinal fissure. And so a fissure, again, just being a deep groove, or sulci being a more shallow groove. So here we can see that longitudinal fissure, that very, very long one, dividing our left and right cerebral hemispheres. We also have a transverse fissure here that is separating kind of part of our occipital and temporal lobes from our cerebellum down here. And then we'll take a look at different lobes of the brain and the sulci and the gyri that are associated with those. So here we have frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. If you think back to the skeleton and you think about the skeleton, the bones overlying these regions and these lobes of the brain are named the same thing. So the bone that's overlying this frontal lobe is termed the frontal bone. This bone that's overlying the parietal lobe is termed the parietal bone. Overlying the occipital lobe is the occipital bone, and overlying the temporal lobe is your temporal bone. So if you already know the skeleton and you're familiar with the bones of the skull, then the lobes of the brain are just the exact same name as the bone that is overlying them. So that becomes it becomes easier to associate different things together whenever you're able to make those connections. Now, you can see all these different wrinkles, and so this is a kind of a side note, but it's important. You may have heard before that when you learn something, or you learn a new task, or you learn some new piece of information, you gain a new wrinkle, or you get a new wrinkle, or something like that. That's not necessarily true. We all have different wrinkles. We all have these wrinkles on the brain. And really, for the most part, different brains of different people generally have the same layout. We generally have the same large gyri, we have the same prominent sulci, and we have the same lobes. And so the idea that learning something new generates a new wrinkle, generates a new gyrus is somewhat of a myth. Okay, so keep that in mind moving forward. You may have heard that before, and so just understand and be aware that if you do hear that, that's not entirely accurate. So here we see one additional lobe that if you pull part of the parietal lobe away from the temporal lobe, you can see this other lobe. This is known as the insula, and just deep to this insula is where you would have one of your lateral ventricles. So in this instance, you would have the left ventricle, the left lateral ventricle right along this general area, just deep to this insula lobe that we're looking at. As we continue talking about these lobes, so if we go back here, we'll learn that each of these lobes are going to be primarily involved with something different in terms of its function. And also the gyri, the individual gyri, are also going to be associated with very different functions known as functional areas. And we'll take a closer look at those. So here are two prominent gyri and one prominent sulci. So you see this, remember a sulcus is just generally just a very shallow groove. And so you see this sulcus running right along here, right in the middle, right in kind of the central area of the brain. And so this is termed the central sulcus because of its location. It's right here along the central aspect of the brain. Just in front of it, you have something known as a precentral gyrus. It is the gyrus, it is the wrinkle that is just in front of, or pre meaning before, just before the central sulcus. So you call it the precentral gyrus. Likewise, you have one that is just behind, or post meaning behind the central sulcus, that we'll call the postcentral gyrus. Okay, so these are the structures. Okay, this is the structure of the brain: postcentral gyrus, precentral gyrus. We will associate something called a functional area with each of these gyri. The postcentral gyrus will get a functional area, and the precentral gyrus will get a different functional area. So that's referring to the fact of, what do these gyri do? What function is associated with them, and not necessarily just what is the name of the structure. So that's very important to understand. One other important sulci. So we saw this sulci, or this large fissure here. You see a large transverse fissure. If you look at this one right here, it's kind of running right here. If we look at some of these brains, it's kind of running right back through here. This is going to be known as the parieto-occipital sulcus, and it's the sulcus that's dividing a large majority of the parietal lobe from your occipital lobe. And so that's just one more little note about that. So when we look at our brain from a section, if we take a section of it, about roughly the outer eighth of an inch to the outer quarter of an inch of this cerebrum, so all what we can see here is this is all cerebrum. It's known as the cerebral cortex. Cortex meaning kind of the outer aspect of it. Now, this outer aspect, when we take a section of the brain and you look at it from maybe a coronal or frontal section, it contains all gray matter. And so if we're dealing with gray matter, what does that imply? What does that mean? So take a second and think about that. Pause the video if you need to. Gray matter is going to consist of neurons and axons of neurons that do not contain myelin, right? So it is unmyelinated parts of the neuron. So we know that parts of the neuron that are unmyelinated include the cell body and the dendrites and things like that. Then maybe the synaptic terminals as well. So, but primarily the cell body. So it's in this cerebral cortex where we have lots of cell bodies. Okay. And again, within the cerebral cortex, within each of these regions that we talked about the different lobes. We talked about the precentral and postcentral gyri. You have functional areas associated with each of those. You have motor areas sending out motor commands. So efferent neurons are those neurons that carry signals away from the central nervous system. So an efferent signal is a motor signal going out. So you have these motor areas, maybe something like stimulating muscle, skeletal muscle to contract. So whenever we want to pick up a pencil from the table, we reach our hand out, we pick that up, and that is a motor movement, and that is initiated in a motor area, and we'll talk about motor areas. We also have sensory areas. So sensory area, maybe we are outside or something, and maybe you step on something sharp, or you're inside and you run into something. Maybe it has to do with temperature, maybe it has to do with pain, maybe it has to do with smell, with our sense of vision. Whatever the sense happens to be, it is going to a sensory area in the brain, and we'll look at a particular functional area that is a sensory area in a particular gyrus. And then we have association areas, and these association areas allow us to kind of associate different things with each other. And so they're not purely motor, they're not purely sensory. They are somewhat of a combination, and they are these association areas. And we'll talk about some of these different ones. We'll talk about part of the prefrontal cortex. We'll talk about part of Wernicke's area as well. So we will talk here about motor areas first. So motor areas, we have a couple of different ones. We have a primary motor cortex and we have a premotor area. So our primary motor cortex is going to be located within the precentral gyrus. So remember that precentral gyrus is just in front of our central sulcus. So the precentral gyrus is the structure, the anatomy, right? The function of it, these functional areas, it's going to contain the primary motor cortex. Okay, so pay attention to when you're reading in the text, or you're reading online, or listening to another lecture or video online. Is it asking about the structure? Is it asking about the precentral gyrus? Or is it asking about the functional area, the thing that it actually is doing? In that case, it would be the primary motor cortex. This is where we have cells that are going to, and neurons that are going to initiate voluntary movement. So whenever, like I said a second ago, if you're wanting to pick up a pencil, if you're wanting to walk, if you're wanting to move your eyes back and forth, if you're wanting to speak, any of these different things, voluntary movements that you can control, it's the signal is going to originate in our primary motor cortex. Okay, it's going to be mapped now to a very specific area, and it's going to travel down the spinal cord in a particular tract. Okay, so you have these white matter tracts. You have descending tracts and ascending tracts. Descending tracts are coming from the brain, from the central nervous system there, and going out to a particular body region. So if you're wanting to go out to the fingers to pick up a pencil, to write something, to write notes, it would originate there in your primary motor cortex. It would travel down the spinal cord in a very specific white matter tract in that spinal cord, and then leave via a spinal nerve, which is part of our peripheral nervous system, and go out to the muscles of your forearm and hand that allow you to pick up a pencil and move it and write notes down. Okay, so that's a primary motor cortex located in that precentral gyrus. Now, our premotor area is similar in that it has to do with motor action, so moving some type of action, but it has specifically to do with things that are learned, or things that may involve repetition. So things like if you learned how to tie your shoes, you learn how to tie your shoes and you don't typically forget how to tie your shoes. Maybe you took a typing class in grade school or when you were younger. That is a learned skill, and it's not something that you forget, really. Even if you don't type for a longer period of time, it's not something that goes away. Riding a bike, you hear the term, it's like riding a bike, you don't forget. And for the most part, that is true. It's in this premotor area where these signals originate that have to do with repetitive actions. Playing the piano, maybe you're a dancer, or maybe you are, if you're a professional athlete, you have this repetition, this certain movement, this certain activity that is very specific, and is very it's very specific to you, and you're able to do this without really thinking, because it is this very learned motor skill. And these signals, again, are starting in this premotor area, which is just in front of your primary motor cortex, part of your frontal lobe. And we'll take a look at that. So here we can see our primary motor cortex as it is part of the precentral gyrus. So again, this is talking about the functional area, functional region of the brain. The actual structure would be the precentral gyrus. And then here we can see our premotor area, kind of right in front of our primary motor cortex. So a good way to start learning these areas and to gain a better appreciation for them is to think about what may happen if you had damage to these different areas. So if you had damage to your primary motor cortex, you're in a car accident, you had a stroke, whatever the case may be. If you're damaging your primary motor cortex, what are you going to see affected? What's going to be a result of that? Well, you're likely going to have some type of motor dysfunction. Maybe you're not able to initiate, picking up a pencil. Maybe you're not able to initiate walking, things like that. If you damage your premotor area, just in front of your precentral gyrus and your primary motor cortex, maybe you would not be able to perform a skill or a task or an activity that had, prior to your injury, been very routine. Maybe you were a very good piano player, you knew how to play the piano, and you had an accident, and now you can't remember how to play the piano. You can't remember how to tie your shoes. You can't remember how to walk, all these different things. And you see this in patients who have had an accident that is similar to this. They forget these very basic routine skills and activities that we generally take for granted and we don't even think about it. When you're getting ready in the morning, you tie your shoes, you don't even think about it. You just do it and it's done. For patients who have had these types of injuries and strokes and damages to parts of their brain, these very routine tasks are no longer routine, and they have to rewire their brain and make these connections all over again. Okay? So now this picture may look frightening to you. It is indeed a little frightening. What this is known as is the motor homunculus. Okay, so if you go back a couple of slides here, we said that it is mapped to specific areas. So our primary motor cortex, it's mapped to specific areas. What this means is that very specific parts of our cerebrum, our cerebral cortex, in this precentral gyrus, which contains our primary motor cortex, certain areas are mapped to certain areas of our body. And the greater the area in this motor homunculus, the larger the area, that means we have more of our brain dedicated to that body region. So what you see here is the hand and fingers, as well as a lot of the face, is much larger and takes up much more room than other parts. So maybe like the upper arm, shoulder, head, neck, trunk, and then our lower limb and genitals here. There's less motor signals and motor neurons going out to those areas, so they are represented as being less than that of the hands and face and tongue and lips here and eyes. So these are areas, you can think of these areas as areas of communication. We communicate with our face, with our speech, facial expressions. We also communicate with our hands. So a lot of our brain is dedicated, in terms of the motor signals, it is dedicated to some type of communication. Okay, so this is the motor homunculus. You can look up pictures on the internet and you'll see very similar type of things, in the sense that different body regions will be greater proportional to other regions, and we'll see something very similar when we talk about the sensory aspect. So all of this right now is motor. When we get to sensory here in a little bit, we'll see something very similar. So we have a few additional motor areas. We have one called Broca's area. Broca's area is primarily on our left cerebral hemisphere. The majority of the population has it in just the left hemisphere. What this is going to be used for is for initiating speech, so motor speech, so talking, right? And so you'll find it just in front of your precentral gyrus and your premotor area. And it's this kind of little triangle circular region that's very small. You really wouldn't notice it if you didn't know that it was there. And again, this is where we're initiating signals, motor signals to go out for our speech and to be able to initiate speech and initiate talking. So we see it right here. Here's our kind of precentral gyrus with our primary motor cortex. Here's our premotor area. And here's our Broca's area right here. We have another one called Wernicke's area, and we'll get to this here in a little bit. This has to do more with being able to comprehend language. But here in Broca's area, this is for initiating speech. And again, you can imagine that all over the surface of your brain, so all of your cerebrum, you have blood vessels. You have blood vessels branching from a network of vessels on the ventral surface of your brain called the circle of Willis. And some of those stretch out here all along your brain. And there's one that kind of runs in this region here called the middle cerebral artery. And if you have a stroke of sorts, whether it's an embolic stroke or a hemorrhagic stroke, and you lose blood supply to this part of the brain, this Broca's area, what may happen? What type of symptoms, what type of things would you see, what type of deficits would you see in a patient who maybe had a stroke in that middle cerebral artery that's supplying some blood to this Broca's area? Well, you're likely going to see them have difficulties with being able to initiate speech. Okay, so this voluntary action of being able to answer somebody's question, being able to describe something and talk about something, these patients may have difficulties in starting that process, this process of talking to others, sharing a story, or being able to being able to answer a question. They know what to say. They hear your question. They know what to say, but it's the act of actually initiating the speech and start talking that tends to give them trouble if they have trouble with Broca's area here. So again, it is a motor area as well. So we will stop there and we'll pick up with sensory areas in part 3.